intriguing and emotional intro with a genuine call to action. What if a routine traffic stop turned into a life-changing moment, not for the driver, but for the officer? What if, in the span of just a few minutes, a man in uniform went from holding authority to losing control? This is the story of a cop who thought he was in charge, until he realized too late who he had really pulled over. It's a story about power, prejudice, and the moment everything shifts. It challenges us to ask, what happens when those who enforce the law forget to uphold justice? But before we dive in, I have a small favor to ask. If you believe in thought-provoking stories that challenge perspectives and spark real conversations, then please take just a second to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It's completely free, but it makes a huge difference in helping us share stories that matter. Now let's begin. When a routine traffic stop turns into a career-defining moment, a police officer's worst assumptions collide with a truth he never saw coming. His target is the man who holds his future in his hands. The sun dipped below the towering skyline of Miami, casting a golden glow over the palm-lined streets. The warm breeze carried the scent of salt from the ocean, mixing with the hum of the evening traffic. Mateo Ramirez, a seasoned professional in his late 40s, was on his way home after a long day at the Miami Metro Justice Center. His black BMW hummed steadily along the highway, the air conditioning blasting as he tried to shake off the day's stress. The faint sound of classical music played through his speakers, his way of unwinding after back-to-back meetings and policy reviews. As he approached an intersection, the yellow light flickered. He eased off the gas, letting the car coast to a stop just as the signal turned red. And then, flashing lights. Red and blue beams danced across his rearview mirror, followed by the sharp wail of a police siren. Mateo's grip on the steering wheel tightened for a split second before he let out a slow breath. He pulled over to the side of the road, rolling down his window as the police cruiser came to a halt behind him. From the car emerged Officer Brandon Hale, a stocky man in his mid-30s with a buzz cut and the unmistakable aura of someone accustomed to authority. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the fading sunlight. Adjusting the belt around his waist, he swaggered toward Mateo's car, his posture exuding confidence, the kind that came from years of knowing he was in control. "License and registration," Hale commanded, his tone flat but tinged with something else. Not quite hostility, but something close to it. Mateo didn't argue. He reached into the glove compartment, his movements steady and deliberate, before handing over his documents. His calm demeanor had been cultivated through years of experience dealing with law enforcement, sometimes as an ally, sometimes as an observer of abuses within the system. He could feel Hale's eyes on him, scanning, analyzing, searching for a reason to dig deeper. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Hale asked, leaning slightly toward the open window. Mateo met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Not entirely sure, officer," he replied, his voice polite but firm. "You didn't come to a full stop at that light," Hale said, though a flicker of hesitation betrayed his uncertainty. Mateo frowned slightly but nodded. "I see. I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Hale didn't respond right away. Instead, he lingered, narrowing his eyes as if trying to place something about the man sitting before him. A routine stop should have ended here, but something about Mateo made him pause. His suit was sharp, his demeanor composed, too composed. He wasn't nervous, wasn't scrambling for an excuse, wasn't acting the way Hale expected. "You're not from around here, are you?" Hale asked, glancing at the Florida driver's license in his hand. Mateo hesitated just long enough for Hale to pick up on it before answering. "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Hale wasn't really listening. His questions were starting to take on an edge, just enough to suggest he was no longer concerned about a traffic violation. There was something else, something that made Hale's jaw tighten ever so slightly. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" the officer pressed. "Just going home," Mateo answered evenly. The words hung between them, the atmosphere shifting subtly. Hale no longer saw just another driver. He saw something else, something that, in his mind, warranted suspicion. Mateo could sense it, the way Hale's posture stiffened, the way his gaze lingered. Little did the officer know, Mateo's calm exterior wasn't naivety, it was control. Hale took a step back, folding the documents with an exaggerated slowness before tucking them into his chest pocket. Then, his voice took on a new weight. "Step out of the car for me." Mateo's fingers curled slightly around the steering wheel, but his face remained impassive. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" Hale's lips twitched, barely concealing his irritation. "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The threat wasn't explicit, but it was there, hanging in the humid air between them. Mateo exhaled slowly, then unbuckled his seatbelt. As he stepped out, Hale's eyes flicked over him, sizing him up. Mateo was taller than the officer, his build lean but strong. His dark navy suit spoke of professionalism, his polished shoes reflecting the fading light, but none of that seemed to matter. Hale gestured toward the front of the car. "Hands where I can see them." Mateo complied, his movements calm and deliberate. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" Hale smirked faintly. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful." Mateo turned his head slightly, locking eyes with the officer. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans?" His voice was quiet, but it cut through the moment like a blade. "Or does this have more to do with something else?" The question landed hard. For a fraction of a second, Hale's composure faltered. His hand twitched toward his belt, a reflex more than anything. "Watch your tone," he said, his voice hardening. "I'm simply asking a question," Mateo replied. There was no defiance in his tone, only a quiet, firm clarity that seemed to rattle the officer more than outright resistance would have. Hale took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works. You got something to hide?" Mateo let the silence stretch before answering, his voice even. "No, officer. I just believe in transparency." And that was the moment Hale realized this was no ordinary stop, and this man was not someone to be underestimated. Officer Brandon Hale's expression shifted ever so slightly, something smug creeping into his features, as if he had already decided exactly what kind of man was sitting before him. He didn't see a professional. He didn't see someone who might be important. He saw a target. "Step out of the car for me," Hale ordered. Mateo Ramirez's grip on the steering wheel tightened for a brief second, the leather creaking under his fingers. But his face, it didn't betray a single thing. His heartbeat was steady, his breath even. Years of experience had taught him the power of control. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" Mateo's voice was measured, polite but unshaken. Hale's lips twitched, a flicker of something there, irritation perhaps, but he masked it quickly. "I asked you to step out of the car," he repeated, this time slower, with an edge sharpening his words. "You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The unspoken threat hung between them, thick in the humid Miami air. Mateo let the silence stretch for a second before exhaling slowly and reaching for the door handle. His movements were deliberate, giving no excuse for escalation. As he stepped out, Hale's eyes flicked over him, sizing him up. Mateo stood just a little taller than the officer, his broad shoulders squared. Though he was well into his 40s, he kept himself in excellent shape, his presence commanding. His dark navy suit fit him perfectly, the crispness of his dress shirt hinting at meticulousness. The polished leather of his shoes caught the glow of the streetlights. He looked like a man who belonged in a boardroom, not on the side of the road being treated like a suspect. But none of that seemed to matter. Hale gestured toward the front of the car. "Hands where I can see them." Mateo complied, stepping forward and resting his palms flat on the cool metal of the hood. His movements were calm and deliberate. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" Hale smirked faintly, his fingers tapping absent-mindedly against his belt. "Just routine," he said, voice casual. "We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful." Mateo turned his head slightly, meeting the officer's gaze without hesitation. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans?" His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "Or does this have more to do with something else?" The words hit their mark. Hale's composure faltered just for a second. His shoulders stiffened and his hand drifted toward his belt, not out of necessity, but out of instinct. A reflex born from feeling challenged. "Watch your tone," Hale said, his voice hardening. Mateo didn't flinch. "I'm simply asking a question. There was no defiance in his voice, just a quiet certainty that was far more unsettling. Hale leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works," he said, his tone probing now, searching. "You got something to hide?" Mateo let the silence stretch, long enough to make the officer uncomfortable. Then finally, he answered. "No, officer," he said, his voice even. "I just believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency, you know?" Hale scoffed but didn't reply. Instead, he took a step back, pacing in a small circle in front of the car. Something about this wasn't playing out the way he expected. People usually got nervous. They stammered, they fumbled, they tripped over their own words. Mateo was doing none of those things. There was no fear, no hesitation, no nervous energy to exploit. Instead, there was control, poise, and that unsettling calm. "You seem pretty confident," Hale muttered, almost to himself, "like you think you know what's going to happen next." Mateo tilted his head slightly, as if considering the thought. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer," he said, voice steady. "Respect is." Hale froze for half a second. The smirk disappeared. In its place, something colder, something sharper. His jaw tensed, and he turned back to face Mateo fully, as if finally registering that this wasn't going to go the way he had planned. The tension crackled between them, electric. Hale realized that, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the one in control. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. His fingers drummed against the holster at his belt, frustration bleeding into his posture. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone like Mateo. His gaze flicked to the BMW, as though searching for some excuse, some justification he hadn't yet manufactured. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Hale said, his voice clipped. "I need to check for weapons." Mateo raised an eyebrow. "Weapons?" he repeated, his tone incredulous but still measured. Hale's jaw clenched. His fingers twitched near his holster again, the weight of authority suddenly feeling heavier than before. For the first time since the stop began, a flicker of doubt crossed his face, and Mateo saw it. Mateo Ramirez held his ground, his gaze locked onto Officer Brandon Hale, unwavering. The streetlights above them cast a cold glow on the pavement, highlighting the tension thickening in the humid Miami air. "Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon?" Mateo asked, his voice steady, measured. Hale's jaw tightened, and for the first time, his confidence cracked. The question had hit a nerve, but he recovered quickly, masking his discomfort with a sharp exhale. "I'm not going to ask you again." His voice was clipped, pushing the interaction toward something more dangerous. Mateo hesitated, not out of fear, but calculation. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face before he turned, placing his palms flat against the hood of his car. The metal was warm from the lingering heat of the day, but the moment felt cold. Behind him, Hale approached, the crunch of his boots on the asphalt cutting through the uneasy silence. The officer patted him down, quick and rough. His hands lingered longer than necessary, a deliberate act, an attempt to assert dominance, a provocation. Mateo didn't react. He didn't flinch, he didn't stiffen, he didn't so much as shift under the invasive scrutiny. The seconds stretched, heavy and suffocating, before Hale finally stepped back. The admission came begrudgingly. "You're clean," he muttered, as if annoyed by the result, as if irritated that he hadn't found something, anything, to justify his suspicion. Mateo turned around, facing him fully. His expression remained composed, but there was an unmistakable sharpness in his gaze. "Of course I am," he said simply, his voice cool and unwavering. "Now, officer, if you're done—" "I'm not done," Hale interrupted, his voice rising slightly. The words tumbled out too quickly, betraying his need to stay in control. Mateo raised an eyebrow, his posture effortlessly relaxed despite the crackling tension between them. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do," Hale continued, his tone accusatory. "Care to explain why?" Mateo folded his arms across his chest, tilting his head slightly as if considering how much he wanted to reveal. "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," he said finally. His voice carried weight, experience. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Hale's eyes narrowed. "That so? You a lawyer or something?" Mateo smiled faintly. "Or something." The ambiguity in his answer seemed to irritate Hale further. The officer stepped closer, his stance aggressive, invading Mateo's personal space. His voice dropped to a near growl. Listen, you think you're smarter than me? Hale sneered. Think you can talk your way out of this? Mateo met his gaze evenly, unflinching. I don't think anything, officer, he replied, his tone calm yet cutting. I just believe in fairness, and so far I'm not seeing much of it here. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. A challenge, whether Hale wanted to admit it or not. Hale took the bait. Fairness? He scoffed. You think fairness is what this is about? His voice took on an edge, his frustration surfacing. People like you always. He stopped himself abruptly. The words lingered like smoke, even though they hadn't fully escaped. Mateo's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. A subtle, unmistakable signal that he had caught exactly what Hale had left unsaid. People like me, Mateo repeated, his voice soft but charged with meaning. Hale bristled, stepping back slightly, as if realizing he had just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. You know what I mean, he muttered, though his tone lacked the conviction it had moments earlier. I think I do, Mateo replied quietly. But his calmness wasn't passive anymore. It was razor-sharp, slicing through the pretense like a blade. And I think we both know this interaction stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago. Hale opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. For the first time he looked uncertain, like he wasn't entirely sure how to proceed. The balance of power had shifted, and for the first time, Hale was on shaky ground. The silence between them was deafening, stretching uncomfortably long until Mateo's voice cut through it, steady and unyielding. Officer, he said, I think it's time you know who I am. Hale's brows knitted, his irritation returning. I don't care who you are, he shot back, though the faint crack in his voice suggested otherwise. Mateo didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. I'm reaching for my badge, he said calmly, watching Hale's hand twitch near his holster. No need for theatrics. I just want you to see it. The words hung in the air, weighted with something unspoken. Hale's eyes followed Mateo's hand, his fingers hovering near his belt as if bracing for something, though he didn't even know what. And then, in one smooth motion, Mateo pulled out a sleek leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge inside. The world seemed to slow for a moment. The street noise faded. The tension, however, thickened. Hale's eyes darted between the badge and Mateo's face, searching, disbelieving. Mateo let the moment linger, savoring the shift in dynamic. Then, finally, he spoke. Mateo Ramirez, he said, his tone almost conversational. Head of Internal Affairs, Miami Division. Hale's breath hitched. His body tensed. His confidence, so unwavering just moments ago, began to unravel. With slow, deliberate movements, Mateo Ramirez reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He was aware of every twitch in Officer Brandon Hale's posture, the way his hand hovered near his belt, ready for a reaction that wasn't coming. I'm reaching for my badge, Mateo said evenly, his voice calm but firm. No need for theatrics. I just want you to see it. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Hale's eyes flickered between Mateo's hand and his face, uncertainty creeping into his once confident demeanor. Mateo pulled out a sleek leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming gold badge that caught the dim glow of the streetlights. The embossed letters read, Miami Police Department, Internal Affairs Division. Mateo let the badge sit there, letting Hale take in every single detail before he spoke again. Mateo Ramirez, he said, his tone as casual as if he were introducing himself to a neighbor. Head of Internal Affairs, Miami Division. Hale froze. His breath hitched. His eyes darted between the badge and Mateo's face, searching desperately for some sign that this was a joke, some shred of humor in Mateo's expression. But there was none, only quiet authority. And something else, disappointment. Hale swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. Internal Affairs, he muttered, the words barely escaping. Yes, Mateo interrupted smoothly, saving him the trouble of fumbling through the realization. He took a step forward, closing the gap Hale had instinctively created between them. I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that the people wearing this badge uphold the integrity and values it represents. The words landed like a gavel, striking a courtroom bench. Hale's face paled. His once unshakable confidence unraveled in real time. His hand slipped away from his belt, as though the weight of his own authority had suddenly become too heavy to bear. Mateo took another step forward. his voice calm but piercing. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Hale?" Hale said nothing. He looked like a man who had just walked into quicksand and had no idea how to escape. Mateo let the silence stretch, allowing the gravity of the moment to sink in before continuing. "It's not the profiling," he said, though his tone made it clear that was bad enough. "It's not even the baseless escalation." He let the words settle, then delivered the final blow. "It's the fact that you've done all of this, without even realizing who you were talking to." Hale's lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to argue, but no words came. Mateo's gaze bore into him, unrelenting. "You assumed that I wouldn't know my rights." A muscle in Hale's jaw twitched. "You assumed I wouldn't understand the very laws you're sworn to uphold." Hale swallowed hard. "And why?" Mateo let the question hang in the air for a moment before finishing it for him. "Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect." The words weren't shouted. They weren't even said in anger. But they carried the weight of an indictment. And Hale knew it. That wasn't just a problem for Mateo. It was a problem for everyone Hale encountered while wearing that uniform. Hale's shoulders sagged slightly, as if the full weight of Mateo's words had finally landed. His gaze flickered back to the badge in Mateo's hand again, as if hoping it might disappear if he didn't look too closely. It didn't. Mateo stepped back, giving Hale a moment to breathe. But his voice didn't lose its edge. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. Hale looked up, his face burning with humiliation. "You're going to take a step back," Mateo continued. "You're going to return my documents, and then you're going to think very carefully about what you say next." Hale hesitated, his lips parted as if still debating whether to push back or comply. But the hesitation cost him. Mateo took another measured step forward, his voice lowering slightly, turning from an assertion into a promise. "You're going to hear from me again," he said. "Not as a driver you stopped on the side of the road." He let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. "But as the man who decides whether you're fit to wear that badge." Hale visibly swallowed. His face reddened as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The reality of the situation had finally caught up. With stiff, almost robotic movements, he reached into his chest pocket and pulled out Mateo's license and registration. His hands trembled slightly as he handed them over. Mateo took them without a word, sliding them back into his wallet. He turned toward the driver's side door of his car, pausing with one hand on the handle. Then, just before getting in, he glanced over his shoulder and met Hale's gaze one last time. "Remember this, Officer Hale?" Hale barely breathed. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone," Mateo said. His voice was calm, steady, unshaken. "It makes you accountable to everyone." With that, Mateo slid into his car and started the engine. Hale remained standing there, his confidence shattered, his future uncertain. But for Mateo, this was far from over. His next move would send ripples through the entire department. The drive home was quiet, but his mind was anything but. The encounter played over in Mateo Ramirez's mind, not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. Hale wasn't the first officer Mateo had encountered like this, and he knew he wouldn't be the last. He had seen this pattern too many times before. The same baseless suspicion, the same abuse of authority, the same assumption that someone like him didn't belong in a suit, driving an expensive car, holding his head high. But this time, things would be different. This time, Mateo had the power to do something about it. The next morning, the early sunlight streamed through the half-open blinds of Mateo's office at the Miami Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. The warm glow did little to soften the cold reality of the file sitting open on his desk. Officer Brandon Hale. Mateo flipped through the pages, his sharp eyes scanning line after line of documented misconduct. His record wasn't spotless, not even close. Minor complaints of unprofessional conduct, excessive stops that disproportionately targeted minorities, vague misunderstandings that had never been properly addressed. Nothing severe enough to force disciplinary action, but enough of a pattern to paint a troubling picture. Mateo leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he absorbed the weight of it all. Hale wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of a deeper issue. And Mateo wasn't interested in putting a bandage on a bullet wound. A sharp knock on the office door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant, Isabella Cruz, stepped inside, a stack of reports balanced in her arms. Her usual bright demeanor was subdued, as if sensing the storm brewing behind Mateo's steady expression. "Morning, Mr. Ramirez," she said, placing the files in front of him. "Here's the summary of last month's misconduct cases." She hesitated, shifting her weight slightly. "Also, Chief Navarro wanted me to remind you about the department review next week." Mateo nodded, picking up the reports without looking away from Hale's file. "Thanks, Isabella." A beat of silence. "Can you schedule a meeting with Chief Navarro for this afternoon?" Mateo asked, his voice measured. "There's something I need to discuss with him." Isabella hesitated, just for a second. She had worked with Mateo long enough to recognize the weight in his voice. "Of course," she said before slipping out of the room. Mateo turned back to Hale's file, but his focus wasn't just on the officer. This was bigger than one man, bigger than one interaction. This was about the culture that allowed someone like Hale to feel justified in his behavior. And if there was one thing Mateo knew, culture started at the top. Later that afternoon, Mateo sat across from Chief Alejandro Navarro in a conference room lined with framed commendations and department insignias. Navarro, a seasoned veteran with graying temples and a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor, listened intently as Mateo recounted the events of the previous night. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Mateo admitted, his voice steady but resolute. "But that would have been a mistake." Navarro leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "This isn't the first time Hale's name has come up," he admitted, "but we've always handled it internally, quietly." Mateo's expression didn't change. "And that's the problem," he said simply. Navarro sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mateo, you know how delicate these things can be. We have procedures in place." "Quiet doesn't fix anything," Mateo interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "Quiet lets it keep happening." Navarro watched him carefully. Mateo leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the table. "It's time to be loud." A beat of silence stretched between them. Navarro's fingers tapped lightly against the wooden table. "What exactly are you proposing?" Mateo didn't hesitate. "A department-wide review." Navarro's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "Not just looking at individual officers," Mateo continued, his tone sharp with conviction, "but our training, our protocols, our accountability systems. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Navarro sat back, considering the weight of Mateo's words. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this," he warned. Mateo's lips curled into something resembling a smirk. "Good," he said. "It's about time someone did." The following weeks were a whirlwind. Mateo worked tirelessly, holding meetings, reviewing reports, speaking with officers, and setting up public forums to hear directly from the community. The Hale incident became a catalyst for change, a turning point that forced the department to confront its flaws head-on. Hale, for his part, faced an internal hearing. Mateo made no effort to hide his involvement. He sat directly across from Hale during the proceedings, watching as the once confident officer squirmed under the scrutiny. There was no easy escape this time. No way to brush things under the rug. The hearing ended with a suspension, but Mateo knew the real victory wasn't in punishing one officer. The real victory would be in fixing the system that created him. And Mateo wasn't done yet. Punishing Hale was never the goal. Preventing the next Hale, that was the real mission. Months later, Mateo Ramirez stood at the podium of a community forum in downtown Miami, addressing a room filled with officers, city officials, and local residents. The energy in the room was palpable, some eyes filled with hope, others with skepticism. But they were listening, and that was enough. Mateo's voice was strong, steady, unwavering. "I'm not here to place blame," he said, scanning the crowd. "I'm here to talk about responsibility, our shared duty to create a system that works for everyone." He paused, letting the words settle. "This isn't just about holding officers accountable," he continued. "It's about making sure that those who swear to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for every person they encounter." His voice echoed through the hall, firm and resolute. "That's the badge I believe in." His gaze swept across the room. "And that's the badge we're building together." A moment of silence. Then, applause. Loud, thunderous, unrelenting. But Mateo didn't bask in it. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a better one. As he stepped down, he glanced at the faces in the crowd, some wary, some inspired. Change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come. And for now, that was enough. Matteo knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. It wouldn't come easily, and it wouldn't come without resistance. But it would come, because people were finally starting to listen, to question, and to demand better. This wasn't just about one officer or one incident. It was about a system, a culture, and the choices that shaped it. And as long as Matteo had a voice, he would use it to ensure that those choices led to something better for everyone. Now, we want to hear from you. What do you think about this story? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation that matters. And if this story resonated with you, subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us all of what's possible when we stand up for what's right. Together, we can be the change.